The courthouse stood 3 miles south of Red Oak in the Choctaw Nation, a rough-hewn building of native pine that had seen 20 winters and more trials than any man could count. On a cold December morning in 1892, the circuit judge of the 1st Judicial District, H.J. Holson, convened a session that would become a ghost story whispered across the Indian Territory for generations to come. The prisoner sat calmly before the bench. His name was Harlan Lewis. He was a Choctaw nationalist, a full-blood, a man whose family had walked the Trail of Tears 50 years before. The charge was murder. The victim was Joe Hocklotubby, a county sheriff and a progressive. The killing had been political, a brutal assassination that took place at dawn on September 10, 1892, in the front yard of Hocklotubby's home, just south of Hartshorn. 18 gunmen had ridden into that yard. Lewis had called out the sheriff's name. When Hocklotubby appeared in his doorway, the rifles erupted. Winchester repeaters, the weapon of choice on the frontier, tore through the lawman's body. He fell dead in front of his own children. Someone fired 2 more shots into his already lifeless corpse. And then the gunman vanished into the autumn mist. But the light horseman caught Lewis within 2 days. The trial was swift. The verdict was death by hanging, a punishment so degrading to the Choctaw people that it was reserved for only the 2 most heinous crimes, sodomy and a second conviction for horse stealing. On that December morning, Judge Holson looked at Lewis and pronounced his doom. Then the judge told him something extraordinary. *, you are free to go. Return here on your own for execution on November 4, 1894 *. The courtroom fell silent. The sentence was passed. Lewis was given 2 years of complete freedom, no guards, no chains, no restrictions. He was expected to honor the Choctaw Code, the ancient tradition that no prisoner ever tried to escape his punishment, even when that punishment meant death. And he did. This is the story of a mystery that has never been fully told, a tale of political assassination, tribal factionalism, forgotten court records, and a haunting question that still echoes through the hills of southeastern Oklahoma. It is a story about the end of a world, about the last execution under Choctaw law, and about what happens when ancient codes of honor collide with the relentless machinery of American expansion. But to understand Harlan Lewis and what his execution truly meant, we must go back. We must understand the world he came from, a world that was already disappearing when he took his first breath. The Choctaw Nation had governed itself long before there was a United States. When the tribe established its first constitutional government in 1822, they created a unique institution to enforce their laws, the light horsemen. These were mounted police officers, elected by the voters in each district, who rode throughout the nation with the authority to arrest, judge, and execute punishment against violators. There were 18 light horsemen at first, 6 for each of the 3 Choctaw districts. The Choctaw Constitution of 1834, the first written constitution in what would become Oklahoma, formalized their role. They were the law in a land where federal authority was distant and often hostile. In 1838, the light horsemen were relieved of their trial duties, leaving them more time to enforce the laws. Eventually, their duties were limited primarily to arrest and execution only. They patrolled the vast territory, a rugged expanse of dense forests, winding rivers, and coal-rich hills, bringing justice to a people who had been forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands in the southeast. The Trail of Tears had been a crucible. From 1831 to 1834, and again in the winter of 1838 to 1839, the Choctaw people were driven from Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana to the Indian Territory. Thousands died on the journey from disease, exposure, starvation, and the violence of their white escorts. But those who survived carried with them their laws, their traditions, and their fierce sense of sovereignty. The light horsemen embodied that sovereignty. They wore no uniforms, carried no badges. A man could be identified as a light horseman only by his authority and by his willingness to use it. When he rode into a settlement, he was the court, the judge, and, if necessary, the executioner. They were paid $15 a month in the years after the Civil War, a significant wage for Indian families living in a currency-deficient society. Most officers used their salaries as collateral at local trading establishments, purchasing goods on credit from merchants like the F.B. Severs General Merchandise Store in Muskogee. At the end of each month, the tribal treasurer paid 1/8 of the light horseman's check directly to the merchant. But the job came with dangers that no salary could compensate. Light horsemen were often the first line of defense against the chaos that had descended upon the Indian Territory after the Civil War. The conflict had devastated the region. In 1866, Chief Allen Wright delivered a grim assessment: every species of lawlessness, violence, robbery, and theft existed within the Choctaw Nation. Wright identified the source of the problem. It was not the Choctaws themselves who had brought this plague of crime, but transient residents and those passing through the country from the states. The white intruders had come like a flood after the war: land speculators, whiskey peddlers, horse thieves, murderers fleeing justice in Texas and Arkansas. The Choctaw Nation had become a natural escape haven for criminals. Completely surrounded by states with their own jurisdictions, the Indian Territory was a lawless buffer zone where white outlaws could hide with impunity. It was the duty of the federal government, formalized by treaty, to protect the tribes from this invasion. The United States had failed completely. Instead, the federal government began encroaching upon the right of the Indians to try their own cases and punish offenders in their own way. A federal court was established for the Western District of Arkansas, first at Van Buren and then relocated to Fort Smith in 1871. In 1875, the infamous hanging judge, Isaac C. Parker, took charge. Parker's court dockets were filled with cases of violence in the Choctaw country. In 1874, a Texas bandit killed a posse man near Little Blue River in the southwest corner of the nation. To the crowd gathered to see his case tried, the outlaw boasted that the dead Lawman was the 8th man I've killed. Niggers and Indians don't count. His statement expressed the typical attitude of white outlaws toward the native population. Even Judge Parker admitted that, left alone, the Choctaw Nation was generally peaceful. He openly stated that most crimes in Indian Territory were caused by intruders and that the resident population is as orderly and quiet as any to be found anywhere. Other observers estimated that 80% of violent crimes in Indian country were traceable to non-Indians. But the damage was done. The white outlaws and their violence had infected the Choctaw Nation. To the dismay of leaders like Chief Wilson N. Jones, some Indians began to act like their white neighbors. Jones's own son, Willie, killed a white man on the streets of Caddo during a drunken spree. The younger Jones was later shot to death after an all-night drinking bout in Denison, Texas. In another widely publicized case, a full-blood Choctaw killed a Mexican traveling through the nation. The Indian had given his victim food and lodging, only to be rewarded by having his boots stolen. Pursuing his former guest, the Choctaw and an accomplice killed the man after recovering the stolen property. The jury at Fort Smith considered the sentence, but all agreed that a boot thief needed killing. These cases represented a profound shift in Choctaw society. The traditional code of honor, which had served the tribe for hundreds of years, was eroding before the world of the white man. The light horseman had always been able to trust that a prisoner would accept his punishment. Once the court prescribed the sentence, the condemned person was usually given complete freedom and told when and where to appear to receive the penalty. But in the 1870s and 1880s, that tradition began to be violated. Peter J. Hudson, in his Recollections, recorded examples of escapes. In one instance, escapees joined a gang of horse thieves headed by a mixed blood named Stephen Anderson, operating along the Little River in southeastern Oklahoma. Replacing the code of honor were jails, a European institution that the Choctaws found deeply distasteful. The construction of jails proceeded slowly. In 1888, Sheriff James Darnell of Scullyville County built a log jailhouse behind his own cabin, where at times he detained 10 to 12 prisoners. Other sheriffs, too far from jails or reliable substitutes, often kept prisoners at their homes, either chained to trees, or to the front porch, or left at liberty in the house. The Choctaw National Council authorized the construction of jails in each county, but most were never built. In 1877, Chief Coleman Cole proposed that a national jail be built near the center of the nation. The council, pleading inadequate funds, never constructed it. There was a deeper reason, too: incarceration was offensive to the Choctaw soul. And so, when Silas Lewis was told to return for his execution on November 4, 1894, he represented the last vestiges of that old world, the world where a man's word was his bond, where honor was more valuable than life itself. But the execution was not the end of the mystery. It was only the beginning. To understand why Silan Lewis killed Joe Hocklotubby, we must understand the political war that had erupted within the Choctaw Nation, a conflict that became so intense that it furnished ample fuel to the proponents of ending tribal government. The campaign of 1892 pitted two factions against each other, the Progressives, or Eagles, who were the educated mixed bloods, and the Nationals, or Buzzards, who were predominantly uneducated full-bloods. But these labels are deceptive. The leader of the Progressives, Wilson Nathaniel Jones, was an uneducated mixed blood from Caddo. The leader of the Nationals, Jacob B. Jackson of Scullyville, was an educated full-blood with a law degree from Roanoke College in Virginia. The divisions were not simply about blood or education, they were about a deeper question that cut to the heart of the Choctaw identity. Both men opposed the termination of tribal sovereignty, but for very different reasons. Jones feared the loss of economic advantages he enjoyed as a wealthy cattleman and landowner. Jackson represented the ideological sympathy of most full-bloods, men who remembered the advice of Pushmataha, the great Choctaw chief who had counseled his people to never put a person with white blood into any position of power in the tribal government. The election itself was a furious contest. The nation was divided, not by geography, but by loyalty to two competing visions of the future. The Progressives believed that the only way to survive was to assimilate, to adopt white education, white economics, white law. The Nationals believed that the Choctaw identity itself was worth preserving, and that assimilation would mean the end of everything their ancestors had fought for. The Nationalists were not wrong to be suspicious. The railroad had arrived in 1872, and with it came a new kind of exploitation. The Choctaw Coal and Railway Company, a corporation created under the laws of Minnesota, had been granted a right-of-way through the Indian Territory by an act of Congress on February 18, 1888. This was a present absolute grant, meaning that the railroad could take land without compensation to the individual occupants until after the fact. A homestead settlement subsequent to the act was subject to the railroad's rights even if the line was not located until after the settler had built a home and planted crops. This was the legal reality of the Choctaw Nation in 1892. The federal government was giving away tribal land to corporations, and the tribal government was powerless to stop it. The land that the Choctaw people had been forced to accept after the Trail of Tears was being stripped away, one railroad grant at a time. The coal deposits that lay beneath the surface only made the situation more desperate. In the early 1870s, when J.J. McAllister initiated the exploitation of coal deposits in the Choctaw Nation, Choctaw law allowed mineral discoverers to claim the resource for 1 mile in each direction and lease it to another party. The railroad-controlled mines paid a royalty of only 1 cent per ton to the Choctaw Nation. The tribes were being robbed, and the government in Washington was complicit. Chief Wilson N. Jones, a progressive, was elected in 1892. But the campaign had turned violent before it was over. And it was that violence that would ultimately destroy the Choctaw government. The attack on Joe Hocklotubby was carefully planned. The assassin's name was Silan Lewis, a nationalist who had become the leader of a band of gunmen loyal to the old ways. On the morning of September 10, 1892, Lewis and 18 men rode their horses into Hocklotubby's front yard, just south of Hartshorn. The sheriff was a progressive, a county lawman who had been elected to enforce the laws of the Choctaw Nation. He was also a man with 5 children. Lewis called out the sheriff's name. As soon as Hocklotubby appeared, the gunman riddled his body with bullets from a barrage of Winchester rifles. As the father of 5 fell, someone fired 2 more shots into his already dead body. The assassins galloped off into the early morning, leaving Hocklotubby's family to mourn and a nation to reckon with the consequences of its divisions. But the light horsemen were swift. They arrested Lewis within 2 days. The trial was held in December 1892 at the courthouse south of Red Oak. Lewis was convicted of being the major organizer of the group. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The fact that Lewis was sentenced to hang, rather than face a firing squad, was a deliberate message. Hanging was considered so degrading to the Choctaw people that it was not used except for the 2 most heinous crimes, sodomy and a second conviction for horse stealing. The only other capital crimes specified within the Choctaw Nation were second offense rape, murder, and treason, but they were usually carried out by firing squad. Lewis had committed murder. But the court chose to hang him, a punishment designed not just to kill, but to shame. It was a message to the nationalists that their violence had crossed a line that the tribe would not tolerate. And yet, the same court that sentenced Lewis to such a degrading death also honored the ancient Choctaw Code. Lewis was given his freedom and told to return for execution on November 4, 1894. He had 2 years. 2 years to flee. 2 years to disappear into the vast expanse of the Indian Territory, or to cross into Texas, or Arkansas, or any of the states that surrounded the Choctaw Nation. The federal courts had no authority to pursue him. He was a Choctaw citizen, tried and convicted by a Choctaw court. The light horsemen would not hunt him down, because they trusted his honor. The question that haunts this story is simple and terrible: why did he come back? The Choctaw Code of Honor was not a law written down in any book. It was deeper than that, a tradition that stretched back to the ancestral lands in Mississippi, before the Trail of Tears, before the white men came with their treaties and their broken promises. It was simply unthinkable for a person to leave the nation and flee to a new or strange country. For a Choctaw, that would have been a fate worse than death, dishonor. Flight would have brought unbearable shame to the individual and his family. His people would have remembered. This was the code that Silan Lewis was raised to follow. He had grown up in a world where honor was the only currency that mattered, where a man's word was his bond, where family loyalty was more important than life itself. And so, on November 4, 1894, Lewis did what the old code demanded. He returned to face his execution. The hanging took place in the presence of the authorities. It was the last execution of a Choctaw under tribal law. After Lewis was dead, the observers went home. The story might have ended there, a simple tale of a murderer who accepted his punishment in the tradition of his ancestors. But the story did not end there. Because the execution of Silan Lewis and the violence of the election of 1892 had consequences that no one could have foreseen. The white authorities in Washington had been watching. And they used Lewis's execution to argue that the Choctaw Nation was incapable of governing itself. The opponents of tribal sovereignty had long pointed to the lawlessness of the Indian Territory as evidence that the tribes could not govern themselves. In 1896, Charles F. Meserve, working for the Indian Rights Association, reported that in a single year, there had been 100 murders in the Choctaw Nation. The figure was wildly exaggerated. Verifiable proof exists that Meserve's figures were false. Many of the cases he cited were, in fact, evidence of the Indian court system working at its best. But the lie served its purpose. It gave the advocates of tribal extinction the ammunition they needed. The proponents of the creation of the Commission to the 5 civilized tribes seized upon the reported lack of law and order within the nations as a further justification for ending tribal sovereignty. They pointed to cases like the Silan Lewis execution as clear and irrefutable evidence that the Indians were incapable of self-government. But what they did not say was that the violence of 1892 had been caused by the very pressures they themselves had created. The election of 1892 had been a war in various parts of the nation, with accompanying bands of assassins and terrorists riding over the countryside shooting or frightening their opponents. And why had the election become so violent? Because the very existence of the Choctaw Nation was at stake. Because the federal government was in the process of dismantling the tribal governments, and the Choctaws were fighting desperately to preserve what remained of their sovereignty. The irony is heartbreaking. The execution of Silan Lewis, an act of justice carried out according to the ancient Code of Honor, was used to argue that the Choctaws were too savage to govern themselves. The very tradition that made the execution possible, the Code of Honor that demanded Lewis return to face his punishment, was used to destroy the culture that had created it. On the surface, the execution seemed like a triumph of law and order. A murderer had been convicted, sentenced, and punished. But beneath the surface, the execution was a death knell for the Choctaw Nation. The Dawes Commission had been established in 1893, the year after Silan Lewis's trial. Its purpose was to allot the lands of the 5 civilized tribes to individual Indians, breaking up the communal holdings that had been the foundation of tribal identity. The Commission's ultimate goal was the end of tribal governments and the incorporation of Indian Territory into the United States as the state of Oklahoma. The Nationalists had fought against this, but they were losing. In 1897, the Atoka Agreement was signed by the Choctaw and Chickasaw governments. The pact was ratified by the Choctaw Nation but not by the Chickasaw Nation. In 1898, the Curtis Act placed all residents of the Indian nations under federal law. The tribal courts were disbanded, and federal courts established total jurisdiction. The Light Horsemen, the symbol of Choctaw sovereignty for over half a century, were no more. By 1906, tribal courts had been disbanded, and federal courts had established total jurisdiction in Indian Territory. In many counties, white men dominated politics, ending Indian control of law enforcement. Even where Indians remained in office, they enforced a federal law code with few remnants of their Indian heritage. In 1907, when Oklahoma became a state, the era of Indian law enforcement totally ceased. Popularly elected officials from Oklahoma counties assumed authority. The destruction of the tribes ended Indian law enforcement. The tradition of the Light Horsemen, men who rode without badges, whose authority came not from a government commission but from the respect of their people, was gone forever. The coal lands that had been the source of so much tension were finally sold in 1947, for $8.5 million. The proceeds were disbursed on a per capita basis to individual tribe members. As always, 3/4 went to the Choctaw Nation and 1/4 to the Chickasaw Nation. But the land itself was no longer Choctaw. The story of Silan Lewis might have been lost to history altogether. The court records of the Choctaw Nation were scattered, destroyed, or simply lost during the chaos of the transition to statehood. Devin Abbott Mehezua, a historian and descendant of the Choctaw people, has documented the difficulty of reconstructing this period. In her book Choctaw Crime and Punishment, 1884-1907, she describes the brutal murder in 1884 of her own great-great-grandfather, Charles Wilson, who was a Choctaw Light Horseman and U.S. Deputy Marshal. She then relates the killing spree of progressives by nationalist Silan Lewis 10 years later. Mehezua draws on a wide array of sources even in the face of missing court records to weave a spellbinding account of homicide and political intrigue. The missing records are themselves a mystery. What happened to the documents that documented the trials, the executions, the daily life of the Choctaw courts? Some were destroyed in fires, a common fate for wooden courthouses on the frontier. Some were deliberately destroyed by officials who wanted to erase the record of Indian self-government. Some were simply lost, filed away in archives that no one had the time or inclination to preserve. What we do know comes from fragmentary sources: the Mashilatubi District Court documents for the spring of 1884, a snapshot of a typical court session that reveals the daily reality of Choctaw justice. The records show murder cases, permit law violations, adultery cases, larceny cases, robbery cases, gambling cases, assault cases. They show fines, lashes, costs of prosecution. They show a functioning legal system, dealing with the same kinds of crimes that any community faces. The records also show the tension between tribal and federal jurisdiction. In one case, David McCurtain, Indian Sheriff of Scullyville County, was sued at Fort Smith by John Ingle, a white man who had entered the Choctaw courthouse carrying a pistol in violation of Choctaw law but claiming exemption because he was a United States official. The council voted $150 for McCurtain's defense. In another case, a national light horseman and a deputy sheriff of Kiamichi County were forced to kill a non-citizen named Alexander Shield when he resisted arrest. The council appropriated $500 for their attorney's fees because it is the duty of the nation to defend her officers when they become involved in difficulties while engaged in the legitimate discharge of their duties. These cases were not just legal technicalities. They were battles over the very existence of Choctaw sovereignty. Every time a tribal officer was sued in federal court for enforcing tribal law, the authority of the tribal government was called into question. Every time the council had to appropriate funds to defend its own law enforcement officers, the nation's resources were drained. And the federal court at Fort Smith, Judge Parker's court, was notoriously biased. White outlaws who had murdered Indians could escape with light sentences or acquittals. One mixed-blood Choctaw, accused of being an accomplice of the infamous Sam Base of Texas, was executed for a murder at Caddo. About the same time, the white assailant of a white railroad worker at Caddo received only life imprisonment. The Choctaws believed the federal court was blind when they came before it. And they were right. Silan Lewis was executed on November 4, 1894. He was given a dishonorable death, a hanging that was meant to shame him. But he was also honored with the trust of the Choctaw court, the trust that he would return to face his punishment. He did. The execution was the last of its kind. It was the final act of the Choctaw justice system, the end of a tradition that had lasted for decades. But it was also the beginning of the end of the Choctaw Nation itself. The white authorities used the execution to justify the destruction of the tribal governments. Here is the haunting irony: if the Choctaws had been more like the white man, if Lewis had fled, if the code of honor had been broken, the execution might not have happened. And if the execution had not happened, the white authorities might have had less ammunition to use against the tribe. But the Choctaws were not like the white man. They were a people who honored their traditions, who believed in their laws, who trusted in their justice system. They were a people who had survived the Trail of Tears, who had built a new nation in a foreign land, who had created a government that worked until the white man came and took it all away. The question that remains unanswered is this: what would have happened if the white authorities had honored their treaties? What would have happened if they had protected the Choctaws from the outlaws and the land speculators and the railroad corporations? What would have happened if they had allowed the Choctaw courts to continue, if they had respected the sovereignty of the Choctaw people? There is no answer to that question. The records are missing. The witnesses are dead. The light horsemen no longer ride through the hills of southeastern Oklahoma, bringing law and order with the authority to arrest, judge, and execute punishment against violators. But the hills themselves remember. The old courthouse south of Red Oak is gone now, replaced by newer buildings that have no memory of the trials that took place there. The front yard where Joe Hocklotubby fell is gone, too, replaced by roads and houses that have no memory of the dawn when 18 gunmen rode in and changed history. And somewhere, in an archive that no one has bothered to fully explore, the court records of the Choctaw Nation are waiting to be found. They are scattered, fragmentary, often illegible. But they exist, the scattered remnants of a world that was deliberately destroyed, a legal system that was deliberately dismantled, a people who were deliberately dispossessed. The story of Silan Lewis is not just a story about murder and execution. It is a story about the erasure of history, about how a nation's memory can be destroyed, how its laws can be invalidated, how its people can be silenced. Lewis's execution was supposed to be a triumph of justice. But it was a triumph that killed the very thing it was meant to preserve. There is a photograph that survives from the late 1890s, a faded sepia image of a Choctaw lawman. He sits on his horse, wearing a wide-brimmed black hat and a reefer jacket buttoned to the chin. The large pearl buttons glint in the sun. His coat is bulged on the hips by the big cavalry revolvers strapped to his side. He is coal black. The photograph shows a black man, a freedman, who had once been enslaved but now wore the authority of the Choctaw Nation. He is a light horseman, a keeper of the peace, a man whose people had been emancipated and who had chosen to remain in Indian territory and serve its people. The light horseman in the photograph is anonymous. His name has been lost. But his image endures, a reminder of a time when the Choctaw Nation was a place where any man, regardless of his origin, could become the law. The black light horseman's authority came from the tribe. He was a symbol of the Choctaw justice system, a system that had been based on honor and tradition for decades. By the time the photograph was taken, that system was on the verge of extinction. The Dawes Commission was dismantling the tribal governments. The federal courts were asserting jurisdiction over the Indian Territory. The black light horseman and his white horse were relics of a vanishing world. He rode until the end. And when the tribal courts were finally disbanded in 1906, he would have ridden into the sunset of history, his authority gone, his people's sovereignty stripped away. What happened to him? What happened to his children? What happened to the people he protected, the communities he served, the laws he enforced? The record is silent. The archives are scattered. The history is fragmented. But the question remains, what does it mean to be a lawman when the law itself is being destroyed? The old Choctaw courthouse south of Red Oak was a rough-hewn building of native pine. It has been gone for decades now. The land where it stood has been plowed and paved. The trials that took place there are ancient history. And yet, if you visit the site on a misty autumn morning when the fog is low over the hills, and the sounds of the modern world are muted, you might just hear something. It might be the wind through the pines. It might be the distant murmur of a truck on a highway. Or it might be something else. It might be the sound of hoofbeats, steady and determined, as 18 light horsemen ride through the mist to arrest Silent Lewis, knowing that he will not flee, knowing that he will return for his execution, knowing that their system of justice, a system based on honor, tradition, and trust, is still intact, even as the white men in Washington are plotting its destruction. And you might wonder, did the light horsemen know what they were fighting for? Did they understand that their justice system was the last barrier against the erasure of their people? Did they know that the execution of Silent Lewis would be used against them? The hoofbeats fade. The mist clears. The modern world returns. And you are left with nothing but questions. What is justice, in a world that does not want you to have it? What is honor, in a world that will use your honor to destroy you? What is sovereignty, when the law itself is the weapon of your dispossession? These are questions that have no answers, not for Silent Lewis, not for Joe Hocklotubby, not for the last light horseman, and not for us. The Choctaw Nation exists today, of course. Its people survive, thrive, preserve their language, their culture, their identity. But the world of the light horseman is gone forever. And the silence left by its passing is the most haunting mystery of all.